Hey, welcome everyone.
Welcome back.
Now, we had a late meeting last night, and I did review some of the notes from yesterday. What I could do is maybe we could start from the DC code and then go to the recommendations for the tasks and assignments email that goes out following working sessions. We were discussing either adding what comes out of this working group in that email or sending a separate one following this meeting with just more robust instructions on how members can go into the documents and share their recommendations, comments, questions. Is that okay with everyone if we just send an email after this meeting? And I'm happy to lead on that.
That's fine. Darren, I put together a draft here. I'm glad to share my screen of just that I thought might just help us talk through this. And which it was just my recollection of everything that we'd written down, because I think it would be good if the three of us just agree to what actually we're approving kind of in writing, so we all don't misunderstand each other at all.
I'm fine with that. I think that's helpful. I would just note that Jen sent the action items email already
Ah,
a little bit earlier today. So it would be a separate email as far as any next steps we might have. But I think it makes sense for us to talk through, um, where we left off with the recommendations. Because as I understood it, the next step at this meeting was then to what we agreed to talk through the operation, how to operationalize those things.
can I share my screen, Darren?
Sorry, I just made you co-host, and yes, Representative Thompson, that tracks with what was discussed about just like the drafting of it, the mechanics of it, and then just sending it out. We can see your screen, Representative Goulet, so
This.
everything is good to go.
So I didn't spend much time with this, but I just kind of wanted to kind of walk through some of the issues with each one of these. I think a couple are easy, one may be a little more challenging, and just make sure we agree. Do you want to start with the easiest one here, which I thought was recommendation 4, which is to afford the state board with great weight requirement in all government agency decisions that impact schools, students, and education stakeholders. I mean, I thought our decision on this was we think this is an important change. We would implement it just as it's written. I mean, it just requires a change to the DC code to put that into effect. It really doesn't require us to change anything because we would still be adopting our resolutions as usual. So, is there anything on this one that we would need to do to effectuate that I'm missing?
That looks right to me.
Okay. I think the next easiest one is number 1. So we'll go to recommendation 1. This was the request to obtain the data from DC education agencies. I thought we talked about we would first make sure we requested the data in writing. And then, if the data is not provided in a reasonable period of time where the education agency declines the request, the state board would then have the authority to request the data by a state resolution of the board, which would require a supermajority. Now, I know Representative Williams mentioned that he thought this would be something we could consider for just a simple majority. I wanted to see how other members felt about that. I felt the supermajority is just one more from 5 to 6. And since, we are basically demanding something from OSSI, I felt like that would be appropriate, but I was interested in what you thought on that. And then I highlighted the 2 time issues here because I wasn't sure if we wanted to specify something as part of our recommendations.
I have one other thing maybe for us to talk about, being with the, do we need to clarify with the first step, the first request that we're talking about the state board acting collectively in some way. That
Mm,
like, what are we talking about? Are we talking about a request that we place like through leadership meeting, or letter, or what?
Well, that's a good question. Would it be a member of the board requesting it, or would it be the collective board? I would think it would just be a member who could have other members sign on because, and maybe I should say this, I'll put that there. That's a good clarification. Because the state board really only acts in unison by votes,
mhm.
right? So, I mean, all the members could sign a letter. That would be more impactful, I suppose, but
Well, we
I
do
was,
have that
We're
model.
not, oh, go ahead.
Just saying, like, for example, the grad requirements letter that we just did, that wasn't a vote. That was just people indicating whether they wanted to sign on to it or not.
yeah.
But I do kind of consider that more of a collective action than just an individual member requesting something.
Yeah, my assumption is that it would be a letter from the board, not from an individual member, that folks could sign on to. And I do think it should be a written request. I like the idea of it being um, a letter first, because it doesn't have to necessarily go through a public meeting. So like if we, um, it, it allows us to be a little more nimble, I guess, in getting the request out. And then if it's not responded to, we then have the option to take a vote at the public meeting in the form of a resolution. I do think, like, I like the idea of escalation as well, because one of my worries is sometimes we write a resolution and then there's nowhere to go from there if it's not responded to. So I like that being the second action step. As far as a reasonable period of time, I don't know what reasonable would be. I would be curious, like, what's already on the books as far as like FOIA requests or council requests to agencies. Um, like, where should we be looking to kind of establish what is commonly seen as reasonable? But I do think we should have a specific time frame in here for the sake of clarity. I because the letter, sorry, moving on to the second part as far as the supermajority, because I would assume that if we send a letter from the board, it already has a majority to go from the board. I don't see a problem in saying it should be a supermajority for the second request, because I just think it's one more person. And I don't know what I can't imagine like what would limit that. But it's not a power we have now. It then becomes like a demand. Um, yeah, I tend to lean to, I will say I tend to lean towards requiring more people to sign on is better. I don't think that's like an unattainable threshold. But I would be open to hearing if that is too challenging, or why folks think that might be too challenging, like 5 versus 6.
What about doing that at the working session? So if we're doing this as a vote of the board to send the letter, would that be something that would make sense then just to have it a working session? So what I put here, like if, let's say, Robert, you want some data on Ward 5 or something like that, and or just you want some citywide data, you put in just an email request for it and they never get back to you. So you escalate it then and say, well, we need to send a letter from the full board to get this information. Or we could start with step 2. We don't need to do step 1, but we could start with step 2, or we could escalate to step 2. And if there's not provided within a reasonable period of time, or the declines the initial request, the board then may send a written letter requesting the data by a majority vote at a working session. So that would be the first request that would escalate it then. Or I don't know that we need to say if it was declined, we could just say the board may send a written letter requesting data by a majority vote at a working session. So this would be kind of either step one or step two, depending if somebody wanted to just request it more informally themselves. I mean, what do you think about that? Because you wanted to send it on behalf of the board.
I'm not sure I would want to tie it to a working session if it's, something that could be worked out over email or getting to a majority of signers. Just because
How
that
else-
is,
Yeah, how else would we do it though? Like if it's being requested by the board, wouldn't we all need to agree to it?
Well, I mean, I feel like in the example of the graduation letter is one, but that's been pretty a common thing. It's like, hey, do other folks want to sign on to send some type of letter to OSSI or to other agencies? And we've been able to work it out via email and
Sure.
set a deadline for folks to sign on, which, like I said, I think allows us to be a little more
Okay.
nimble instead of having to tie it to a meeting date. Because I could imagine a situation where, let's say, the data request was actually in preparation for something we needed to vote on. And we would want to be able to make the request so that we can inform ourselves for the vote. I think the school nursing is a good example when we requested certain information from Department of Health in order to be knowledgeable about what we put into the resolution and corresponding and subsequent, legislation. So I lean toward letter first just because of our meeting structure and then resolution. Also, I feel like with the resolution, it immediately is public. And I think sometimes it behooves us to make the request not in a way that's not public, but like that'll help us then like know what to say in public, if that makes sense.
It does. What do you think of the language I put in now, right here? The board may send a written letter requesting the data and shall provide all board members with the opportunity to sign on to the letter. So it would basically be like we do letters right now, but
Mm-hmm.
does that sound better or?
and so are those letters that we've been doing, I think they always have had a majority, but like, are we not sending those if a majority don't say, yes, I sign on?
We don't send them from the board if there's not a majority. So like if, I don't know, let's say the graduation letter, only 3 people decided to sign on, we would not transmit it and say, hey, the board wants this information, because it wouldn't be true that the board wants it. Doesn't mean that a member couldn't correspond with that agency and make an ask, or a couple of members, but it would not, they couldn't say it's from the board. And then they would have to do some additional work, I guess, to win people over to be able to exercise this authority as it's written here.
So would you envision it if the member wasn't able to get 5 or 4 colleagues to sign on, that wouldn't trigger the ability to do it by resolution?
Correct. Because even if it was a regular resolution, if you don't have a majority, you wouldn't be able to have a resolution.
Okay, so
While you're typing that, just today I was updating the standard operating procedures specifically around letters of inquiry. And so if you get a chance to review that language, I think that ties in with this very well of work coming out of, in this case, I put in the committees, but like if there's an inquiry or there's a need for data, what that would look like. And I took voting out of it. But I could, if you have any comments on that, that would look good in there. I think another thing that you mentioned around what is reasonable, I have not reached out to NASB just yet, but that might be a good question to ask of what data requests might look like from state boards, and there are different levels of it. And so maybe like different options for the amount, like what a timeline might look like and the level of detail for that, because sometimes you might ask for something specific and you don't want the kitchen sink thrown at you with all the data. You might want something that is I don't know, like disaggregated data or something very specific. And in those cases, it would change the nature of the ask and a reasonable timeline for that.
So the FOIA looks like it uses 15 business days as the standard. Does that sound good? What do you think?
I think that's helpful. I'm not opposed though to Darren also just reaching out and see what other state boards things are, but I think I can't think of a reason FOIA would have a different standard than we would.
I mean, if it was a huge request that was really time intensive, I mean, I think we'd want to be reasonable with it and not demand it necessarily, or if it was like a period of time where OSSI was in performance oversight or something really extraordinary, but I mean, 15 business days sounds reasonable for most requests.
How do we, well, how do we define large requests? I mean, I guess it could be that, and let me say, can I just think out loud? So, um, it 15 days is like the floor. So if you don't have it in 15 days, I mean, we could then have a conversation, I would imagine, as a board of like, do we need to wait longer? But and given you might have to wait until a working session and a public meeting, it might end up being more than 15 days anyway. And so I think of this as I guess as I'm saying it out loud, I read this as it can't be day 14, but it could be anytime after 15 business days.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. Thank you for bearing with me.
And I'm tweaking this too. How's that for language?
It looks okay to me. I would just say I'm less concerned that it be a super majority. But I think, if the two of you prefer that, it's fine for that to come out of here and we can talk about it as a board, and maybe that doesn't have the support. I mean, maybe having only a majority doesn't have the support.
Yeah. How do you feel, Ebony Rose? I'm glad to make it either. So.
I'm fine with it as written.
Okay. Okay. So how does this, so the process I've written here is that anyone can send a request for data in his or her individual capacity. So we're certainly not precluding that. Like you could request data, I could request data. But to initiate this process, we have to go with step one. And I'll just put it like this kind of. And then this will be step two. So the board would have to send the letter requesting the data, and they would provide all board members with the opportunity to sign on. If the letter's got the 5 or more members as signatories, and if it's not required. Okay. I mean, does this look good to you, Darren? Is there anything? I'm not saying the language is perfect, but is the substance there? You're on mute.
Thanks. It's towards the end of the day and it was a late meeting, but I will definitely read through and add to it along with maybe the other members. To me, it looks fine. I think my only question, I think for this group is, do you consider this an expansion of board authority? Because right now we have this is already within our abilities as a board.
Do we have the ability to require they submit it though?
I mean, I'm just saying
No.
like a letter and then a FOIA request.
This isn't a FOIA request, though. We're just borrowing their timeline. So we're not doing a FOIA request. So this would be that they're required to send us the data. If they refuse, we're really giving us the ability to write the letter to try to, I'll just speak for myself on this, but to try to maintain a level of cordial relationship with OSSI or any of the other agencies where, first we would just simply request it in writing versus trying to make them send it. We would ask for it. And so
Right.
so that's why, we're trying to create this extra barrier so people aren't just jumping directly to trying to pass a state resolution demanding data.
And
If that makes sense.
yeah. And it might also be helpful at some point if you could copy and paste that to the shared. I see you're in the shared document.
I'm not in any shared document. I just saved this on here and I can send it over to you, but I'll be just glad to send this to everybody. I was just trying to, I probably should have just done it in the shared document, but I wasn't sure if I could share that. And so I'll just send this to all of you or just paste it in there. So now the next one is 2, and this is the harder one. So I may just borrow some of the language because we perfected that language up top. So I still think we just want to say this, maybe just that any may request OSSI. Okay. So do we want to follow a similar pattern here where we send a letter requesting the initiation of policy first, like is that still the next step for this?
I think so. I think so. I don't see a reason we wouldn't try to talk to Aussie about it first. Yeah.
I agree. I think the timeline will be longer on this one.
Yeah, that makes sense to me too. And is it okay if I think out loud as to why?
Yeah, of course.
So I agree with that this timeline would be longer because we would have the conversation, make the request. We would expect that Aussie would take some time to look at what else is coming down the pipe, some of their capacity stuff. There might be some additional back and forth with the board, but I don't think this is just like a information gathering. I think there's a certain amount of assessment that goes into this. Um, and I would hope that they would come back with some type of recommendation, like timeline.
Okay.
And I
'Cause
think maybe, sorry,
no, sorry, it was a delayed thought. Because I think what I do want to have as reasonable, I could see as a possibility. Like, let's say we sent over, we want to do these 3 things this year. And it might not actually be, they might come back and say, look, we can do 2, or here's why, right? Like, I think that's why. But I don't know how to put it, but I do think the assessment is like of incapable of capacity is important here.
yeah, and I think it was Eric that said something about giving it enough time that um, it would include a budget cycle so that if um, capacity, if if budget would have an impact on whatever we were asking, they would have time to consider that.
Yeah, so, I mean, looking at it here, this may seem too long for you both, or it may seem too short based on what, if we're really trying to give them a full extra budget cycle. So, I said here, if the letter requesting the data has 5 or more members as signatories, and if OSSI does not submit the requested policy, how should we phrase this? So we're not really requesting the substance of a policy change. It would be like saying, please submit revised social studies standards or something to the board, but we wouldn't specify what had to be in there, right? So how would we phrase this? The requested.
Yeah, that's tricky.
Maybe it's initiate. Like, maybe it's a timeline. Maybe it's not that they need to submit the policy, but there's something about initiating the process. Because what I also appreciate is different standards, or different types of materials require a different lift. So social studies is not something you go and pick up from off a shelf necessarily, especially, just given what we've seen in other parts of the country. But financial literacy could be. And so maybe the timeline is around initiation, and OSSI coming back with a plan for how they do it and what the process will be, instead of saying they have to deliver us the policy.
I agree with you in substance on that as being like a better way to do it. The only thing that worries me a little bit, it's more of a loose term, like submitting something is a firm action on it, where initiating the policy is a little looser in terms of what initiation means. And I'm not saying OSSI would do this right now, because I think we've worked really well with them, but if there was ever an adversarial situation, like, they could claim they were initiating the process, but then drag the process out for years or something like that, create a process that's
Yeah.
just absurdly long or something. So,
Could it be tiered? Could it be initiate within a certain time and maybe deliver within another
yes,
window or something?
that's good.
I don't, I would say my only hesitancy around that is like what we saw with, and this was true for social studies as well, but like currently with the health standards and them being pulled, what if there is a reason to pull something or delay something that's not simply adversarial between our,
Well, we could always pass a future resolution striking the old one, rescinding it.
that's true.
Yeah.
Like
So,
granting an
Yeah,
or
extension. Okay.
just, yeah, grant the extension, or to say, it is revoke the old one in total.
Yeah, the other thing I'm thinking of is like the previous work on graduation requirements that, was initiated was, well, it never ended up happening. Or, if policy could initiate policy, submit policy, and then just like if we vote it down, just not bring it back. Isn't that what we're trying to avoid?
Yeah. I mean, what would be a reasonable timeline you think to, like, for them to initiate and for them to submit? I mean, it seems like it's about 6 months for any of these processes we've done. I mean, it could be less if it's something shorter, like the menstrual health standards or something, but how long would you want to give them? The only reason I picked a year, even though it seems like a long period of time, is like, let's say they've already got something in the queue, like let's say they've got standards that they're all ready to send down. And then they say, we just don't have the capacity to do this right now. Like, how long do we want to give them to initiate? I mean, a year probably would be the outer limit of it, but what would you think is reasonable? Is it 6 months? Is it 9 months? Is it a year?
I mean, I think the ones we've tackled have been shorter ones. I do think social studies was a longer one. And it needed, it really was more than a year. It was like, ended up being like 2 years. And that wasn't, there's some reasons for that. Like part of it was OSSI's internal capacity and transition and leadership and all the different things. But I still think even if everything was perfect, it still probably would be at least a year.
To
For things like
initiate or to approve it or to submit it?
to work on it, like to do the full process of yes, we are definitely doing social studies standards to get from yes, we are definitely doing social studies standards to here are the standards. I also know there was like a pre thing that the board did, which essentially people decided on things like the values and said to OSSI, like, hey, here's where we need to make improvements. Please initiate on social studies. And I'm using social studies as like something that necessitates a longer process versus things that can be done in like 3 months or 6 months. Because sometimes we're talking about technical changes or just like amendments. And it's no reason that would take a year.
Yeah, though for the sake of this, should we use like kind of the most arduous example, which would be the social studies standards, is kind of the key, because it's impossible to really say what's
Yeah.
easy versus hard. So like if we pick something that would be kind of on the outer edge of what we think, would stretch their capacity,
Yeah. I
that
mean,
would probably be good.
Darren, you were around um, for the beginning of that. Is
Yeah,
that
I start when I started the SISAC, the Social Studies
that's
Standard
what it was called? Yeah.
Evaluation Committee, something like that. That was state board initiated or started, but working with OSSI before they started the process of building out the standards. So that advisory committee provided kind of like a framework or guiding principles. And then OSSI created their own work group to build out the standards. And then there was back and forth. So the entire process was just like 3 years. It was a long process. So I think once OSSI took over the process, it was over a year.
So what I've written here, which I do not stand by at all, but I'm just trying to kind of, so this would give here, if 5 or more board members sign the letter, and if OSSI refuses to initiate within 1 year, or if they don't submit within 2 years, or if they just simply decline the request, So would that be reasonable based on the social studies standards, or is that not? What do you, I don't, I mean, would 6 months be appropriate here, but then like a year and a half or 2 years? Like, what do you think makes sense?
I think that does sound a bit reasonable. I'm trying to think of the extremes for this. And
Yeah.
maybe if like a scenario was written out, I could kind of pick it apart and see what that looks like. Because something like, because policies aren't, it's not just standards. It would also be things like attendance, anything under the state board's purview.
Yeah.
To initiate. Um,
And we probably want to make that clear too. Issuing policy, which is under the state board's formal statutory purview.
Yeah, that's in the recommendation text
Yeah.
above.
mhm.
So my other question is about whether the timing, what would the timing then be after escalation to a state resolution?
And I almost think it
then-
was, they start again, but
Then Aussie could, run out the clock for,
like almost 4 years.
yeah,
Like, I'm just trying to envision, like you mentioned the worst case scenario, Darren, like something like, let's say we're in the middle of social studies and somebody really wants to do math. And that takes like a similar effort to do as social studies. So like if we're in the middle of the social studies process, yeah, I feel like we could say, well, we've got to finish this up. It's going to take a full year to finish it, and then we'll send you math or something like that. So I don't know how under a scenario like that you could do under a year and under 2 years, because it's just the
Yeah, is that what, I mean, and not that this is perfect now, but is that where like performance oversight comes in from the council? Like, is that, like, is this something we can tackle in the, how we operationalize it, or is this, are we getting into the area of this is the process, and if people don't adhere to the process, what other levers do we have to pull?
I don't know. That's the question is, I mean, I think they would be required to do it in this instance because it would be statutory.
I'm just thinking through the worst case scenario bad behavior part. Like if it was bad behavior, like whose job is it to referee the bad behavior, right? And I don't know if you know what I mean. Like
What? Was that a bark or a sneeze?
that was both.
That might be another question, Evan, Representative Thompson for NASB, maybe, just to see what other state boards do. Or like that are similar to or as close to our state board makeup as possible of like what those levers look like and what happens if something's not initiated.
Yeah, I mean, there are good examples, because I do know there are, state boards who have some of these things in place already. I think this would be a good use of not reinventing the wheel.
And also that the time span, if you make it a bit more flexible, like that 1 year, 2 years. I'm just thinking the initial talks with Aussie of just like, hey, we're interested in this, what would it look like, or how long would something like this take? And then
Well,
kind of,
couldn't you start, so like with something like the CISAC, and I'm happy to reach out to Jessica to see like some of the steps that were taken. But isn't there, how would I say it, pre-work that could happen? Um, where the state board could then put a proposal on the table saying like, hey, we want to do, let's just stick with social studies. We want to do social studies, Aussie, and we think the best, we need to set some parameters around that. So we're going to start a task force, right? And like, we would not have to necessarily already like start this process to do that, but maybe there's a point once the task force gets to a certain point where there is a then formal request for them to pick it up. I think those are some of the things you just navigate in like relationships, but it doesn't prohibit the board from doing some pre-work to say, and honestly, I do believe there is a certain amount of pre-work what we should do to say like, all right, look, here's why we want to do this, or here's why we want you to take this up. Because I also think that it helps us give not guardrails, but I mean, maybe it is guardrails, but it helps us make sure if there are certain things that are important to us to see in standards or policy, that we are also just sharing that information up front, saying like, hey, we want you to tackle this.
so maybe building into this a process around that, I think just to avoid a member overriding that and just writing a letter requesting it. Those other steps would need to take place or some steps would need to take place first before a written letter.
I'm curious what other members think, but I don't I don't know if I have a strong opinion about a uniform process for this, especially because different subject matter areas have different levels of variation, right? Like I can't imagine that if we decided to update our math standards, that we wouldn't work with like a national consortium, or we wouldn't go to um, some things that are already established, which is different than, I don't know, social studies or even like SEL or some of the others that we've delved into. So I don't think the same amount of quote unquote pre-work is necessarily the same, because there's different resources to tap into in different, yeah.
And to your question, Darren, I wouldn't want to take away from a board member who just wants to raise an issue with Aussie and just say, hey, I'm interested in AI standards. Um, are you thinking about that? Are you interested in that? And I mean, my hope is that we would never have to do this, right?
Right.
Like that we would never have to actually come to a resolution to do it, that we would generally just work it out.
Right. Same.
I agree too. And if we sent them the letter with the 5 or more signatories and they came back and said, hey, we've really got social studies up right now. So if you'd let us wait, a year and a half on math, but we are willing to do it, then we wouldn't have to go to the last step, which is doing the state resolution. I mean, we wouldn't need to go to that length. Like this would be really a case where things have broken down and they just simply refuse to do something that the supermajority feels is very important.
Yep.
And I really warmed to this idea, Ebony Rose, based on your comments, which I thought was really, I think, very useful and informative about saying that really this should be the board's purview. Like we have a very select list of issues, And we shouldn't have to run to the council for legislation to make OSSI do something. So I like the idea of trying to handle it internally, but I think we just have to set, deadlines for ourselves on this, because we couldn't have a situation where like the 5 members sign the letter and then say, you got to have it to us in a month or something like that, if it's something
Right.
complex. So I think it's important, since this will be in the DC code, that we set standards that we think are achievable.
Agreed.
Because otherwise, they could get nixed on a fiscal impact statement that says, it's creates unfunded mandates or something like that. So can I just walk through this and make sure this makes sense? So this would be, the board sends the letter asking OSSI to formally initiate policy on something. And then from the date of the letter, that if it has 5 or more members signing on, if OSSI doesn't initiate the process within a year, if they don't submit it within 2 years, or if they simply say no, then we get the additional authority to do a state resolution that requires them to initiate within a year and submit within 2.
Mhm.
Does that make sense? Though, and I don't know that it does. I'm just being the scribe of this, so we all are the same mind.
I appreciate you being described. As
And
I'm
this
here.
isn't- It's not in statutory format right now. I could format this. I mean, you'd have a series of, semicolons and things like that, but
No, I don't need more semicolons just yet. I feel I feel good about the plain language.
And this is separate from the second part of this recommendation, amending policies.
yeah,
brought to the
you know,
board.
we,
So
yeah,
maybe making sure that
I'll
it-
put that in here too.
I thought we were striking the amending.
Yeah.
yes, exactly, or yeah.
So maybe we should say that explicitly.
Tired. See, my tiredness is reflected in poor typing skills. The state board.
Yeah, we can't do 10:30 meetings, you guys. That was pretty brutal. So I appreciate, the fact that we all made it here today.
I'm giving credit to the student reps because we have a planning meeting at 6 o'clock today for our SAC meeting on Monday. So I have no idea what level of engagement we're all going to have in this meeting.
They're young and energetic though.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah, they'll be sprightly, hopefully.
Yeah, they'll be fine. I'm not worried about that. They
That's true.
Okay, I'm just trying to, how does that look? So, I mean, do we agree with step 2 though? That's the one I was most concerned about there for.
I think so. I mean, I could, go 3 months either way on the time things, but I think 1 year and 2 years.
Yeah, I'm not wedded
Well-
to this, so if you think it's too long or too short, I mean,
No, I mean, I think it's reasonable, and I think it's harder to object to if we err on the side of
Mhm.
giving a
they
long
would be
run.
getting up to 4 years, well, up to 3 years essentially to do this, because like if they don't do anything within the first year, then we could move forward, but they'd still get 2 years. So they have up to basically 3 years to do it. You know, so that's quite a long period of time.
Yeah, I think that allows for all the things we would want them to be able to do,
And I
align their
think it,
goals,
yeah,
capacity, and so on.
it would be pretty hard for them to argue, even under the most extreme scenario, that they don't have time to put that in their work plan within 3 years, or that they don't have the time to free up staff capacity to do
Mhm.
something if you give 3 years to achieve it. That seems like a pretty reasonable proposal. The only thing I could see going wrong with this, if there was like some very zealous future version of the board that did multiple ones of these at the same time, I mean, that could become a problem. Where like basically members horse trade, and then you have 6 members all trying to get a standard in within this 3 years. I mean, that would be the only way I could see this going wrong. I mean, so we could, in theory, limit this to one action per year or per 2 years or something like that.
I mean, I think I'm comfortable with it as it is. I don't I don't want to go too far in either direction, right? Of like people might abuse it or Aussie might abuse it. Um this 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 feels like a reasonable starting point. And I would be and I feel like this is a good place to elevate and get feedback from the rest of the board around.
Okay, I support this then. Are you good with that, Robert, then?
Yes, I am.
And in addition to these recommendations or this language and the mechanisms, there would also be a report. So like I'm trying to capture these concerns or considerations that can be in addition to this
Yeah.
language for the report for members to consider, like um the timing of these things or like the limiting the number of initiating policies or why that's not a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, we could, if we were really concerned about it, do something that says, you know, the board may not pass more than one of these per year or for 2 years, but I would hope people wouldn't do that. I would hope this would be an extreme step that we never have to get to.
I agree with Representative Thompson. I think like leaving out the limitation.
Okay.
I agree.
It's also like infantilizes the state board a little bit. Like
Yeah.
you're all adults, elected members, and you can figure out what's in reason for something like that.
Okay. Is that everything?
That's everything. On the code, the only thing I found on the code to change was that one section with taking that nurse language out. I mean, was there anything else we were looking at changing on the DC code? Other than obviously these changes to effectuate these recommendations.
I thought there were a couple places that we had some questions, but I would have to look back at the notes. I don't think we had anything else that we were like, we knew needed to be changed. Like, uh, there was one around charters.
Oh, right, there was questions about whether or not those were actually under our authority, right?
Correct. There were a couple places where we needed some clarification.
Do you remember what those were? I can pull it up right now.
Well, it's things that are under our authority, but we don't know if they're relevant anymore. Wasn't that the issue?
They were
I think we were worried that the charter school board came into being after this was approved, maybe, and that
In conflict.
that they were maybe also giving conflicting powers or something, and they were doing it, but
I'm gonna share the committee, the working group report. It captured those items.
Okay, I'll unshare then, right? Don't I need to not share?
Mhm.
Okay, let me stop sharing. No, did you already get me to stop sharing? I don't want to share. Am I off share, Darren?
No, not yet. If you just turn it off, or I can just take your place in just a moment.
Yeah, it's not letting me unshare the document.
Got it. Let me just do this. I think this is it. Can you all see this?
Yes.
So just going down. Oh, I'm sorry. So I'm on 29th.
I've got it. I found how to stop it. It was hidden by my window, so.
These were the items, submitting budget to mayor, approved state policies for supplemental education service providers. Representative Thompson, I think you were gonna take lead on that. But I'm happy to take lead if that's helpful.
I can't remember what I was supposed to do, but I mean, the SES, I don't even think it's a thing anymore.
Yeah,
Like
Uh,
that should just be scrapped.
approve the list of charter school accreditation. So these were 4 items that we highlighted, and then further down, I just have our action items. And so these are things I'm going to tackle in February,
Mhm.
and then report back. I think maybe just as we're gathering feedback from the wider members, I could be working on this, and then when we meet on the 20th, I could come back with what I find and how that might be included or added to the language. Is that helpful?
Yes. And Darren, if you go up a little ways there, I think I also had the nursing one in there, which was separate here.
I
Somewhere.
think it
Yeah,
was
it's
right
in there.
here, highlighted section
Yeah.
6.1.
Yeah, that's just a technical fix, but we should probably just clean that up as we do it. But
You mentioned other sections too, like the possibility and
I
the
just be honest, I'm probably not gonna search the rest of the code for like places where it mentions the state board, like the old version of it in a random place that's not been scrutinized. I mean, I think what will happen is as council finds those, just by happenstance, usually when they amend other, the code with other bills or something like that, they probably just clean it up either in that bill as a technical change, or if they find it, they put it in the Technical Amendments Act, which is like an omnibus bill they pass usually once every council period or something. So, I mean, I just happened upon that one because I was doing the school nurse legislation, but I wouldn't dare say I have enough time to try to find all the old references to the old school board and update those.
for the time being for this nurse one, shall I include that in the shared document for members to review and then we'll include it in the report?
Yeah, I think we would, I don't know who's doing that function now. We could either just strike it or we could put the correct agency in there.
Mhm.
But I know it's not us who's doing that. I think it was DC Health.
Yeah, that updated language is in the working group report.
Yeah.
Of what you shared.
That sounds good to me. I have to jump off so I can go to another meeting.
Okay, thank you all. And I'll share out the notes from this one shortly.
Okay, thanks, Darren.
Hey,
Thanks.
everyone, thanks.
Thank you.